Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most brutal survival challenges. Not climbing Mount Everest, not crossing the Sahara, but something far more terrifying. Being born a woman in medieval Europe, because while Hollywood loves to romanticize the Middle Ages with brave knights and fair maidens, the truth is, if you were a peasant woman between 1,200 and 1,400, your life was a relentless nightmare of backbreaking labor, constant danger, and zero control over your own destiny. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with a simple truth. You wouldn't last a week as a medieval peasant woman, not because you're weak, but because the entire system was designed to crush you before you even learned to walk. From the moment you drew your first breath, you were considered a disappointment. Boys were celebrated, girls were tolerated. Your parents looked at you and saw not a daughter, but a burden, another mouth to feed until they could marry you off to someone else's problem. Your childhood, if you can call it that, ended around age 7. While modern kids are learning to ride bikes, you were learning to grind grain with stones that weighed more than you did. Your tiny hands would blister and bleed as you worked the quern, turning wheat into flour while your mother prepared for the next baby, because there was always a next baby. Medieval families didn't stop at 2 kids and a white picket fence. They kept going until the mother died in childbirth, or the father couldn't feed any more mouths. By age 10, you were essentially a miniature adult. You hauled water from wells, tended livestock, spun wool until your fingers cramped, and helped deliver babies, because trained midwives were a luxury your village couldn't afford. You watched women scream and die in labor, knowing that would be your fate too someday soon. Because in medieval society, a woman's primary purpose was simple: breed until you die. Education? Forget it. Reading was for priests and nobles, not for peasant girls whose destinies were already written in dirt and sweat. While boys might learn basic letters if they were lucky, girls learned practical skills: how to preserve meat without it rotting, how to birth a calf, how to identify which herbs might stop bleeding and which ones would kill you. Useful knowledge, but it kept you trapped in a cycle of endless manual labor. And let's talk about that labor. Modern people complain about 8-hour workdays. Medieval peasant women worked from dawn until they collapsed, every single day, for their entire lives. There were no weekends, no sick days, no vacation time. Sunday was supposedly a day of rest, but that just meant you did lighter work while pretending to be pious. Your typical day started before sunrise, not with an alarm clock, but with roosters, crying babies, or the sheer urgency of survival. You'd stumble out of your straw-filled bed, assuming you had one, and immediately begin the first of dozens of daily tasks. Milk the cow, if your family was wealthy enough to own one. Feed the chickens. Collect eggs. Haul water from the well or stream, balancing heavy wooden buckets that turned your shoulders into permanent knots of pain. Then came breakfast preparation, but this wasn't cracking eggs and popping bread in a toaster. You had to grind grain into flour, build and maintain a fire without matches, knead dough with your bare hands, and bake bread in a communal oven that you had to walk miles to reach. The bread itself was dense, gritty, and often filled with sand from the grinding stones. It would wear your teeth down to nubs by the time you were 30. But it was calories, and calories meant survival. While the bread baked, you'd tend to the animals. Medieval peasants lived alongside their livestock, literally. Pigs, goats, and chickens shared your living space because keeping them outside meant losing them to wolves, thieves, or harsh weather. So your home was part barn, part human dwelling, and entirely aromatic. The smell of manure was so constant you stopped noticing it, which was probably for the best. After breakfast, the real work began. If it was planting season, you'd spend hours bent over in muddy fields, dropping seeds into furrows while trying to avoid cutting your bare feet on rocks and debris. Your back would scream in protest, but you couldn't stop. Food security depended on every seed finding its proper place. During harvest time, you'd cut grain with sharp sickles, your hands bleeding from the constant gripping, racing against weather that could destroy months of work in a single storm. But fieldwork was just one job. You also had to maintain the household, which was like running a small factory with no tools and no help. Clothes didn't come from stores, they came from sheep. You had to shear the animals, clean the wool, spin it into thread, weave it into fabric, and sew it into garments. This process took months and had to be repeated constantly, because clothes wore out quickly under heavy use. Food preservation was another full-time job. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no canned goods. Everything had to be dried, salted, pickled, or smoked to survive the winter. You'd spend autumn frantically processing every vegetable, herb, and piece of meat you could get your hands on, knowing that a single mistake could mean starvation when the snow fell. And speaking of winter, let's talk about the cold. Medieval peasant homes had no insulation, no central heating, and often no glass in the windows. You'd stuff gaps in the walls with moss and mud, but winter wind found every crack. The only heat source was a small fire that consumed precious fuel and filled the house with smoke. You'd go to bed wearing every piece of clothing you owned and wake up with frost on your blanket. Water was another constant challenge. Wells were communal and often contaminated. Rivers were used for everything: drinking, bathing, washing clothes, and dumping waste. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were common killers, but you had no choice but to drink whatever was available. Boiling water helped, but fuel was expensive and time was scarce. Personal hygiene was practically impossible. You might bathe once a month if you were lucky, and that meant heating water over a fire and washing in a wooden tub that doubled as a feeding trough for animals. There was no soap as we know it. You used harsh lye made from ash that stripped your skin raw. Your hair was a breeding ground for lice, which you picked out with your fingernails while doing other tasks. Privacy didn't exist. You shared your one-room home with parents, siblings, children, and livestock. You changed clothes in front of everyone, gave birth while the family watched, and relieved yourself in a shared pit or bucket. The concept of personal space was as foreign as indoor plumbing. Let's talk about marriage, because this is where your life took a sharp turn from difficult to nightmarish. You didn't choose your husband. Your father did. Marriage was a business transaction, and you were the commodity being traded. Your value was measured in how much work you could do, how many children you could bear, and how little trouble you'd cause. Most girls were married by age 14, often to men decades older. Your wedding night wasn't romantic, it was traumatic. You knew nothing about sex, except that it hurt and often resulted in pregnancy. There was no concept of consent, no understanding of female pleasure, and certainly no birth control. Your body belonged to your husband, legally and practically. Pregnancy was a death sentence many women faced repeatedly. Without modern medicine, childbirth killed about 1 in 10 women, and those odds got worse with each subsequent birth. Labor lasted for days sometimes, with no pain relief except perhaps some herbal concoctions that may or may not have helped. You gave birth on straw-covered floors, attended by women who knew little more than you did about anatomy or sanitation. If you survived childbirth, your troubles were far from over. Medieval infants died at shocking rates. Roughly half of all children didn't live to see their 5th birthday. You'd watch babies you'd carried for 9 months die from diseases that are easily treatable today. Scarlet fever, whooping cough, dysentery, simple infections from minor cuts. You'd bury child after child, and the only comfort was the knowledge that this was normal, expected even. But you couldn't grieve for long, because there was always work to do. New babies needed feeding, and you were expected to nurse while continuing all your other duties. No maternity leave, no help with household chores, no acknowledgement that you'd just endured a life-threatening experience. Within days of giving birth, you were back in the fields, baby strapped to your body, working until your stitches reopened and your body begged for rest it would never receive. The constant cycle of pregnancy and loss took a devastating toll. Your body aged rapidly. By 30, you looked 50. By 40, if you lived that long, you were considered ancient. Your teeth were rotted or missing from poor nutrition and multiple pregnancies. Your spine was permanently curved from years of heavy lifting. Your hands were gnarled and scarred from countless injuries. But even physical exhaustion wasn't your worst enemy. The real killer was the complete lack of control over your own life. You couldn't leave an abusive husband. You couldn't refuse sex. You couldn't choose not to have children. You couldn't own property. You couldn't make legal decisions. You existed at the mercy of men who saw you as a tool for labor and reproduction. Your husband could beat you, and it was not only legal but encouraged by the church as a way to keep women in line. The saying rule of thumb supposedly comes from the medieval law that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. Whether that's historically accurate or not, the sentiment was real. Women were considered inherently sinful, weak-willed, and in need of masculine correction. If your husband died, which was likely given the dangerous nature of medieval life, you didn't gain freedom. You became a burden on your eldest son or were passed along to your husband's brother like inherited livestock. Widows without male relatives often ended up begging or starving because there were no social safety nets for women who couldn't support themselves. The church, which dominated every aspect of medieval life, offered little comfort. According to religious doctrine, women were inherently inferior, created from Adam's rib to serve man. Eve's original sin meant all women were morally suspect, prone to temptation, and responsible for humanity's fall from grace. This wasn't just theological opinion. It was the foundation of laws and social customs that kept women powerless. Religious festivals provided brief respites from work, but even these came with their own dangers. Feast days often meant excessive drinking, which led to increased domestic violence. Holy days required special foods and preparations that added to your workload. And if anything went wrong, if crops failed or animals died or children got sick, the blame often fell on women. You were accused of insufficient piety, of attracting God's wrath through some unknown sin. Speaking of accusations, let's talk about the constant threat of being labelled a witch. This wasn't just a problem during the famous witch trials of the 15th and 16th centuries. Throughout the medieval period, women who were too independent, too knowledgeable about herbs, too outspoken, or simply too unlucky, could find themselves accused of consorting with the devil. The evidence required for witchcraft accusations was laughably thin. Did you know how to heal with plants? Suspicious. Did you live alone? Definitely a witch. Did your neighbour's cow die after you had an argument with him? Clearly your fault. Did you float when thrown in water? Guilty. Did you sink and drown? Well, at least you were innocent. These accusations weren't random. They were often used to eliminate women who threatened the social order, widows with property, healers who competed with male doctors, women who spoke up against injustice. Witchcraft charges were a convenient way to remove inconvenient women, while reinforcing the message that female independence led to damnation. But even without formal accusations, you lived under constant suspicion. Women were blamed for everything from bad weather to failed harvests to epidemic diseases. If the crops failed, maybe the women hadn't prayed hard enough. If children died, perhaps their mothers had somehow attracted evil. This psychological burden, the knowledge that you could be held responsible for any misfortune, added another layer of stress to an already impossible existence. Let's return to the practical realities of daily survival, because the mundane details are often more horrifying than the dramatic ones. Take something as simple as getting dressed. You owned perhaps 2 or 3 garments total, all made from rough wool or linen that felt like wearing a hair shirt. These clothes were never properly cleaned because soap was expensive and time was scarce. You washed them occasionally in cold water, but mostly you just aired them out and hoped for the best. Undergarments barely existed. Some women wore simple linen shifts, but many went without anything beneath their dresses. This meant that menstruation was a monthly nightmare of blood-soaked clothes and improvised rags. There were no sanitary products, no privacy for changing, and no understanding of basic hygiene. You simply endured and hoped no one noticed the stains. Your shoes, if you had them, were basic leather coverings that offered little protection from stones, thorns, or cold. Many women went barefoot year-round, developing thick calluses that cracked and bled. Frostbite in winter was common, leading to lost toes and permanent damage. The work never stopped, not even when you were sick or injured. A broken bone meant gritting your teeth and continuing to labor while it healed incorrectly. A fever meant sweating through your chores while your body fought infection without any medical help. Cuts and wounds were bound with dirty cloth and left to heal or fester on their own. Medical care, when it existed at all, was often worse than the original problem. Bloodletting was the cure for everything, which weakened already malnourished women even further. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or sterile instruments. Childbirth complications were treated with prayer and hope rather than actual medical intervention. Pain was simply a constant companion. Your back ached from bending over constantly. Your hands were perpetually sore from gripping tools and hauling water. Your feet hurt from walking on rough ground. Your head pounded from poor nutrition and constant stress. But complaining was pointless because everyone suffered, and suffering was considered a woman's natural state. The diet that fueled this endless labor was barely adequate to sustain life. Breakfast might be a piece of hard bread and some weak ale. Lunch was often skipped entirely because there was no time to stop working. Dinner was typically a thin pottage made from whatever vegetables and grains were available, perhaps flavored with a bit of bacon fat if the family was prosperous. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or when an animal died unexpectedly. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available during growing season. The rest of the year, you survived on preserved foods that were often moldy, wormy, or rancid. Malnutrition was universal, leading to stunted growth, weak bones, and compromised immune systems. Hunger was a regular visitor, especially during the late winter and early spring when stored food ran low. These hungry months claimed many lives as people's bodies, already weakened by poor nutrition, couldn't fight off diseases. Children and elderly women were particularly vulnerable, often giving up their portions so that working-age adults could maintain their strength. Water quality was another constant health threat. Wells were often contaminated by nearby waste pits. Rivers carried sewage from upstream settlements. Even rainwater collected in barrels quickly became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease vectors. Every drink was a gamble with death, but dehydration was a more immediate threat than potential illness. The cycle of seasonal work meant that rest was impossible. Spring brought planting, which required long days of back-breaking labor in muddy fields. Summer meant tending crops, while also gathering wild foods, making hay, and preparing for harvest. Autumn was a frantic race to bring in all crops before winter, followed by intensive food preservation work. Winter, supposedly the quiet season, was spent spinning, weaving, repairing tools, and maintaining animals while fighting off cold and hunger. This relentless schedule continued regardless of pregnancy, illness, or injury. A woman in labor might finish her morning chores before retiring to give birth, then return to work within days. Broken bones were splintered with sticks and wrapped in cloth, but the work continued. Fevers were endured while maintaining the household, because there was no one else to do it. The psychological toll was immense. You watched children die regularly, not just your own but those of neighbors and relatives. You lived with the constant fear of famine, disease, war, and natural disasters. You had no control over your reproduction, your living situation, or your daily activities. You existed at the mercy of weather, landlords, husbands, and a social system that viewed you as expendable. Sleep, when it came, offered little respite. You shared a bed with your husband, children, and sometimes extended family members or servants. The mattress was a sack filled with straw that quickly became lumpy and infested with insects. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions, making restful sleep nearly impossible. Dreams, if you remembered them, were probably nightmares about the next day's work or fears about your family's survival. There was no time for the luxury of imagination or hope. Your world was bounded by the village limits and defined by the endless cycle of labor and childbearing that would continue until you died. And death, when it finally came, was often welcome. By the time most peasant women reached their 40s, their bodies were so broken and worn that continued existence was more suffering than living. They'd lost most of their teeth, suffered through multiple pregnancies and miscarriages, buried half their children, and endured decades of back-breaking work with inadequate nutrition and no medical care. The irony is that despite all this suffering, peasant women were absolutely essential to medieval society. They produced the food, raised the children, made the clothes, and maintained the households that kept civilization functioning. Without their unpaid, unrecognized labor, the entire feudal system would have collapsed. Yet they received no credit, no respect, and no relief from their burdens. Your life as a medieval peasant woman wasn't just difficult, it was designed to be disposable. You were a cog in a machine that consumed human lives to maintain the power and comfort of a tiny elite. Your suffering wasn't an accident or a side effect. It was a feature of the system, a necessary sacrifice to keep lords fed and knights mounted and priests comfortable. This is why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval peasant woman. Not because the work was hard, though it was. Not because the living conditions were rough, though they were. But because the entire structure of society was built on the assumption that your life had no value beyond what you could produce and reproduce. You were born to suffer and die in service to others. And that knowledge would crush your spirit long before the physical labor broke your body. But we've only scratched the surface of medieval misery. Let's dive deeper into the specific horrors that made being a peasant woman a living nightmare. Because if you thought the daily grind was bad, wait until you hear about the violence, the superstition, and the complete lack of legal protection that defined your existence. Violence was woven into the fabric of medieval life like thread through cloth. As a woman, you were particularly vulnerable because you had no legal standing to defend yourself and were seen as property rather than a person. Your husband could beat you whenever he felt like it, and society not only tolerated this but actively encouraged it as a form of discipline. The church taught that women were naturally disobedient and required physical correction to stay on the righteous path. Beating your wife wasn't abuse. It was responsible household management. The only restriction was that you shouldn't beat her so severely that she couldn't work the next day. After all, damaged property was still property, and property needed to be functional. But domestic violence was just the beginning. Medieval Europe was a continent at war with itself. Conflicts between lords, invasions by foreign armies, and raids by bandits meant that violence could erupt anywhere, at any time. When armies marched through your village, you weren't a civilian to be protected. You were spoils of war to be claimed. Rape was so common that it was barely considered a crime. If a soldier or knight decided he wanted you, there was nothing you could do to stop him. Your husband might object, but that would likely get him killed, leaving you and your children completely defenseless. The legal system offered no recourse because women couldn't testify against men in most circumstances, and even if they could, who would believe a peasant woman's word against a knight's? When war came to your village, and it came often, you faced impossible choices. Stay and risk death, rape, or enslavement. Flee and abandon everything you'd worked to build, probably starving in the wilderness. Hide and hope the soldiers didn't find your hiding place, which they usually did because they were experienced at hunting human prey. War wasn't quick and clean like in the movies. Medieval armies lived off the land, which meant they stole everything they could carry and destroyed what they couldn't. Your grain stores, your animals, your tools, your home, all of it could disappear in a single afternoon. Years of backbreaking work could be wiped out in hours, leaving your family to face starvation. Even in peacetime, violence stalked you. Bandits operated with virtual impunity in many regions because there was no effective law enforcement. A group of armed men could ride into your village, take whatever they wanted, and ride away knowing that no one would pursue them. The local lord might eventually send soldiers to deal with persistent bandit problems, but that was more about protecting his property than protecting you. Domestic disputes often turned deadly. When your neighbor accused you of stealing eggs or letting your pig damage his garden, there was no police force to mediate. Instead, these conflicts escalated until someone was seriously injured or killed. Women were particularly vulnerable in these situations because they couldn't legally defend themselves and were seen as easy targets for retaliation. The justice system, such as it was, offered no protection for peasant women. If someone wronged you, your only recourse was to appeal to the local lord, who might or might not care about your problem. More often, you were told to accept whatever happened as God's will and be grateful it wasn't worse. Trial by combat was still practiced in many regions, but women couldn't participate directly. If you were accused of a crime, you had to find a male champion willing to fight for you. And good luck with that, if you couldn't pay. Most men weren't eager to risk their lives defending the honor of a peasant woman they barely knew. Even the church, supposedly a place of sanctuary, offered little real protection. While priests preached about the sanctity of life and the importance of charity, they rarely intervened when women were abused. The church hierarchy was entirely male and reflected the same attitudes about women's inferior status that permeated secular society. Religious authorities were more likely to blame women for the violence they suffered than to help them escape it. If your husband beat you, you must have provoked him. If you were raped, you must have tempted your attacker. If bandits targeted your village, perhaps the women there weren't pious enough. The burden of responsibility always fell on you, never on the perpetrators. Speaking of the church, let's talk about how religious doctrine made your life even more miserable. Medieval Christianity wasn't the gentle, forgiving faith that modern believers might recognize. It was a harsh, punitive system that saw suffering as a virtue and submission as a divine commandment. As a woman, you were automatically suspect in the eyes of the church. Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden had condemned all women to be viewed as temptresses and troublemakers. You were inherently weaker than men, both physically and morally, which meant you needed constant supervision and correction to stay on the path of righteousness. The church controlled every aspect of your reproductive life. You couldn't use any form of birth control, even if effective methods had existed. Having sex for pleasure rather than procreation was sinful, and since you had no say in when or how often your husband demanded sex, you were automatically complicit in sin every time you failed to conceive. Pregnancy was viewed as both blessing and punishment. On one hand, bearing children was your divinely ordained purpose. On the other hand, the pain of childbirth was your punishment for Eve's disobedience. You were supposed to suffer during labor because that suffering was justice for original sin. If your children died, which they frequently did, you were caught in another impossible bind. Grieving too much suggested you lacked faith in God's plan. Grieving too little suggested you were unnatural and heartless. You had to walk a perfect line between devastation and acceptance, expressing just the right amount of sorrow to seem human without appearing to question divine will. The church demanded a significant portion of your family's resources in the form of tithes. 10% of everything you produced went to support priests who lived far more comfortably than you did. During times of famine, when your family was literally starving, you were still expected to hand over a tenth of your meager harvest to support the local clergy. Religious festivals disrupted your work schedule without offering real rest. Instead of working in the fields, you were required to attend long religious services, often standing for hours in cold churches while priests delivered sermons in Latin that you couldn't understand. These holy days added to your workload because the preparation required extra cooking, cleaning, and special activities. The church also controlled education, ensuring that women remained illiterate and dependent on male interpretation of religious doctrine. You couldn't read the Bible yourself, so you had to accept whatever the priest told you it said. This gave religious authorities enormous power to manipulate and control women through selective interpretation of Scripture. Confession was another tool of control. You were required to regularly confess your sins to a priest, including intimate details about your marriage and personal thoughts. This information could be used against you if you ever caused trouble or challenged authority. The seal of confession was supposed to protect you, but in practice, priests often shared information with secular authorities when it served their interests. The threat of excommunication hung over every aspect of your life. Being cut off from the church meant social death in medieval society. No one would trade with you, help you, or even speak to you. Your children would be considered illegitimate, your marriage invalid, and your soul damned. This threat kept women in line more effectively than any physical punishment. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of religious control was how it taught you to blame yourself for your suffering. If your life was miserable, it was because you weren't faithful enough, weren't submissive enough, weren't grateful enough for God's blessings. The system that oppressed you also convinced you that you deserved that oppression. Let's examine the seasonal cycle of misery that defined your year. Each season brought its own particular horrors, creating a calendar of suffering that repeated endlessly until you died. Spring started with hope, but quickly turned into a race against time. The stored food from the previous harvest was running dangerously low, but new crops wouldn't be ready for months. This was the starving time, when families survived on thin gruel made from whatever scraps remained. Your children's ribs showed through their skin, and elderly family members often died from the combination of malnutrition and cold. But even as you starved, you had to plant the next crop. Weak from hunger, you still had to break the hard ground with primitive tools, scatter seeds with precision, and pray that weather and pests wouldn't destroy your efforts. Your hands were so weak from hunger that you could barely grip the plough, but failure to plant meant certain death the following winter. Spring rains turned fields into muddy quagmires that sucked your bare feet into the mire. You worked in these conditions from dawn to dusk, your clothing soaked through, your body shivering with cold. There was no shelter in the fields, no break from the elements. If it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you got cold. If the sun came out, you baked in wool clothing that couldn't be removed for modesty's sake. Lambing season brought its own challenges. Sheep and goats gave birth at all hours, often requiring assistance that you were expected to provide. You'd spend sleepless nights in drafty barns, helping animals deliver babies while trying to save as many as possible. Every lost lamb meant less wool, less milk, and less food for your family. Summer intensified every hardship. The heat was brutal, made worse by heavy clothing that you couldn't remove. You worked in fields where the sun beat down mercilessly, with no shade and no rest breaks. Heat stroke was common, but you couldn't afford to stop working. Crops needed constant tending, weeds pulled, pests controlled, and irrigation maintained. The growing season was also illness season. Dysentery spread rapidly in hot weather, killing the weak and elderly. Mosquitoes bred in standing water, spreading malaria and other diseases. Food spoiled quickly without refrigeration, causing deadly food poisoning. Every meal was a gamble with death, but hunger was a more immediate threat than potential illness. Haymaking was one of the most grueling tasks of summer. You had to cut grass with primitive sickles, turn it repeatedly to dry evenly, and get it stored before rain could rot it. This work bent your back at painful angles for hours at a time. Your hands blistered and bled from gripping tools. Your arms ached from the repetitive motions. But the hay was essential for feeding animals through winter, so you endured the pain. Autumn brought the harvest, which should have been a time of celebration but was actually a period of frantic terror. Everything you'd worked for all year could be lost if weather turned bad, or if you couldn't get crops gathered quickly enough. You worked 18-hour days, racing against frost, rain, and early snow. The physical demands of harvest were enormous. You bent over constantly to cut grain stalks close to the ground, maximizing the yield. You hauled heavy bundles of grain to storage areas. You threshed grain by beating it with flails, a process that filled the air with dust and chaff that clogged your lungs. Your back spasmed from the repetitive bending. Your hands were cut and swollen from handling rough stalks. Threshing grain was particularly miserable work. You stood in dusty barns, swinging heavy flails to separate grain from stalks. The dust was so thick you could barely breathe. Your eyes streamed with tears from the irritation. Your throat burned from inhaling particles. But you couldn't stop, because winter survival depended on processing every grain of wheat and barley. Food preservation consumed much of autumn. You had to dry fruits and vegetables, salt meat, make cheese, brew ale, and prepare everything else that would sustain your family through winter. This work was time-sensitive and labor-intensive. Meat had to be processed immediately after slaughter before it spoiled. Fruits had to be preserved at peak ripeness. There was no room for error because mistakes meant starvation. Winter brought a different kind of suffering. The field work stopped, but indoor work intensified. You spent long, dark months spinning wool, weaving cloth, sewing clothes, and maintaining equipment. Your hands were always busy because idle hands meant wasted resources your family couldn't afford. The cold was your constant enemy. Your breath froze in the air inside your house. Water froze solid in containers overnight. You wore every piece of clothing you owned and still shivered constantly. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes regularly. The lucky ones just lost feeling. The unlucky ones lost limbs to gangrene. Fuel for fires was strictly rationed because wood was precious. You gathered every scrap of burnable material, from twigs to dried dung to scraps of cloth. The fire couldn't be kept burning all night because you couldn't afford the fuel, so you went to bed in a freezing house and woke to ice crystals on your blankets. Food stores dwindled as winter progressed. By late winter, you were surviving on thin soup made from bones and scraps. Your children cried from hunger, but there was nothing more to give them. You watched family members grow thinner and weaker, knowing that some might not survive until spring. Winter was also when most people died. The combination of cold, malnutrition, and crowded living conditions created perfect circumstances for disease. Influenza, pneumonia, and other respiratory illnesses swept through communities, killing the young, old, and already weakened. You might lose multiple family members in a single winter, but you couldn't afford the luxury of extended grief, because surviving required all your energy and attention. The psychological impact of this seasonal cycle was devastating. You lived in constant fear of the next season's challenges. Spring meant starvation. Summer meant backbreaking labor in brutal heat. Autumn meant frantic work to avoid winter death. And winter meant cold, hunger, and disease. There was never a time of ease. Never a season to look forward to with anything but dread. This cycle repeated every year for your entire life. There was no escape, no improvement, no hope that things might get better. You aged rapidly under the constant stress, your body breaking down from overwork and poor nutrition. By your 30s, you looked like a modern 70-year-old. By your 40s, if you lived that long, you were considered ancient. Let's talk about the specific health challenges that medieval peasant women faced, because the lack of medical knowledge and resources created horrors that are almost unimaginable today. Your body was simultaneously your most important tool and your greatest vulnerability, and you had no real way to protect or maintain it. Pregnancy and childbirth were basically Russian roulette with extra pain. Without any understanding of sanitation, anatomy, or proper medical care, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things you could do. Labor often lasted for days, with you screaming in a dark, dirty room while well-meaning but ignorant women tried to help. The process was brutal from start to finish. You labored on straw that had probably been used by animals. The midwife, if you had one, worked with dirty hands and unsterilized tools. If complications arose, the options were prayer, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, or death. There was no understanding of infection, no pain relief, and no surgical intervention if things went wrong. Breech births were often fatal for both mother and child because no one knew how to safely deliver a baby in that position. Prolonged labor could lead to exhaustion, dehydration, and death. Hemorrhaging after birth killed many women because there was no way to control severe bleeding. Even minor tears became infected because no one understood the importance of cleanliness. If you survived childbirth, the recovery period was still dangerous. Childbed fever, caused by infection, killed many new mothers in the days following delivery. You were expected to return to work almost immediately, even though your body needed weeks to heal. Lifting heavy loads and doing physical labor with unhealed wounds often led to complications that could prove fatal. Miscarriages were common but poorly understood. You might lose a pregnancy and have no idea why, blaming yourself for some imagined sin or failing. Multiple miscarriages took a terrible toll on your body and your mental health, but there was no support or understanding for women dealing with pregnancy loss. Maternal mortality was so high that many women considered pregnancy a potential death sentence. You might survive 1 or 2 births, but each subsequent pregnancy increased your risk of death. Women who had many children often died in their 30s, their bodies simply worn out from repeated pregnancies and births. But pregnancy complications were just one aspect of the medical nightmare. Basic hygiene was impossible to maintain, leading to constant health problems. You couldn't wash regularly because water had to be hauled from distant sources and heated over precious fuel. Soap was expensive and often ineffective, so you remained dirty most of the time. This lack of cleanliness led to skin diseases, infections, and infestations. Lice were universal, living in your hair and clothing, and causing constant itching. Fleas bred in the straw bedding and bit you throughout the night. Bed bugs infested furniture and left painful, itchy welts. Scabies caused intense itching and spreading rashes that never seemed to heal. Dental health was catastrophic. The bread you ate daily was full of grit from grinding stones, which wore your teeth down to nubs. Sugar was rare, but the poor diet and lack of oral hygiene still led to rampant tooth decay. By your 20s, you probably had multiple cavities and missing teeth. By your 30s, you might have lost half your teeth. Tooth pain was excruciating and constant, but there was little you could do about it. Pulling teeth was the only treatment, and it was done without anesthesia using crude tools. Many people lived with abscessed teeth that caused chronic pain and could lead to deadly infections if the infection spread to other parts of the body. Malnutrition was universal and had devastating effects on your health. The diet was monotonous and lacking in essential nutrients. Vitamin deficiencies caused scurvy, rickets, and night blindness. Iron deficiency led to anemia, making you weak and constantly tired. Protein deficiency stunted growth and prevented proper healing from injuries. This poor nutrition made you susceptible to every disease that came along. Your immune system was compromised, so minor illnesses that modern people shake off easily could be fatal. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia. A small cut could become a life-threatening infection. Injuries were common and healed poorly. You worked with sharp tools, heavy objects, and dangerous animals every day. Cuts, burns, broken bones, and sprains were routine occurrences. But without proper medical care, these injuries often healed incorrectly, leaving you permanently disabled or in chronic pain. Broken bones were particularly problematic. They were set by local healers, who had no real understanding of anatomy. Splints were made from whatever materials were available, often resulting in poorly aligned bones that healed crookedly. Many people lived with permanent deformities from improperly healed fractures. Burns were another constant hazard. Working around open fires for cooking and heating meant frequent burns from sparks, hot metals, and boiling liquids. These burns often became infected because there was no understanding of proper wound care. Severe burns were usually fatal because shock and infection couldn't be treated effectively. Work-related injuries were inevitable, given the dangerous nature of medieval labor. Hauling heavy loads strained your back and joints. Using primitive tools led to repetitive stress injuries. Working around large animals resulted in kicks, bites, and crushing injuries. Every day brought new risks to your already fragile health. The cumulative effect of poor nutrition, hard labor, frequent pregnancies, and constant exposure to disease meant that your body aged rapidly. Joint problems were universal by middle age. Your spine became permanently curved from years of bending over. Your hands became gnarled and arthritic from constant use. Mental health, though not understood as a medical issue, was another major problem. The constant stress, trauma, and loss took a severe psychological toll. Depression and anxiety were probably universal, though they were seen as spiritual failings rather than medical conditions. Postpartum depression was common, but went unrecognized and untreated. The lack of privacy and personal autonomy contributed to psychological problems. You never had a moment alone, never had control over your own body or decisions. The constant surveillance and judgment from family and community created a pressure cooker environment that was psychologically damaging. Sleep deprivation was chronic. Babies needed feeding throughout the night. Sick family members required care around the clock. Animals needed tending regardless of the hour. You might get a few hours of interrupted sleep each night, but deep, restorative rest was rare. This chronic exhaustion made every other health problem worse. Women's specific health issues were poorly understood and often ignored. Menstrual problems, urinary infections, and gynecological issues had no effective treatments. You simply endured whatever problems arose, often suffering in silence because discussing such matters was considered shameful. The final insult was that despite all this suffering, you received no sympathy or acknowledgement for your health problems. Pain was considered a normal part of being a woman. Illness was often blamed on moral failings rather than physical causes. You were expected to continue working regardless of how you felt, because your family's survival depended on your labor. This created a vicious cycle where poor health made work harder, which made health worse, which made survival more precarious. You lived in a constant state of physical discomfort and medical vulnerability, with no hope of improvement and no resources for effective treatment. Your body was both your livelihood and your enemy, wearing out steadily under impossible demands. Now let's examine the social isolation that compounded all these physical hardships. As a medieval peasant woman, you weren't just physically trapped by poverty and labor, you were emotionally and socially isolated in ways that would drive modern people to madness. Your world was incredibly small. Most peasant women never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Your entire universe consisted of your village, the surrounding fields, and perhaps the nearest market town if you were lucky enough to visit it once or twice a year. This geographical isolation meant that you knew the same few dozen people your entire life, with very little variety or stimulation. But even within this tiny world, you were isolated by gender roles and social expectations. You couldn't participate in many community activities because they were reserved for men. Village councils, trade negotiations, and political discussions happened without female input. You were expected to listen and obey rather than contribute ideas or opinions. Your relationships with other women were complicated by competition and jealousy. Resources were so scarce that other families were often seen as rivals rather than allies. If your neighbor's crops failed, that might mean more work for your family. If her children thrived while yours struggled, that could indicate divine favor or disfavor that affected your social standing. Friendships were luxuries you couldn't afford. There was no time for social visiting when every daylight hour was needed for survival tasks. You might chat briefly with other women while working, but deep emotional connections were difficult to maintain when everyone was struggling just to stay alive. The constant presence of family members paradoxically increased your isolation. You were never alone, but you also never had genuine privacy or personal space. You couldn't express emotions freely because others were always watching and judging. You couldn't pursue individual interests because your time belonged to the family collective. Marriage often increased rather than decreased isolation. Your husband was usually chosen for economic reasons rather than compatibility. You might spend decades living with a man who was essentially a stranger, sharing a bed but never truly connecting. Communication between spouses was often limited to practical matters rather than emotional sharing. The age gap between husbands and wives often created additional isolation. Older men who had already lost previous wives to childbirth or disease might view their young brides more as servants than companions. These relationships were transactional rather than emotional, focused on labor and reproduction rather than mutual support. Language barriers could create isolation even within families. If you married someone from a different region, you might struggle to communicate effectively. Regional dialects varied significantly, and literacy was so rare that written communication was impossible for most people. The church, despite its community focus, often increased women's isolation. Religious doctrine emphasized female submission and silence. You were discouraged from asking questions or expressing doubts. Your spiritual life was mediated through male authorities who might not understand or care about your specific struggles. Confession, supposedly a source of spiritual comfort, could actually increase isolation. Admitting to struggles or negative thoughts could be used against you later. Many women learned to keep their real feelings hidden, even from religious authorities, creating an internal isolation that was psychologically damaging. The seasonal nature of medieval life created patterns of isolation. Winter brought physical isolation, as travel became dangerous and communities turned inward. But even summer gatherings often excluded women or relegated them to serving roles rather than full participation. Economic isolation was another factor. You had no independent income or resources, which meant you couldn't make choices about how to spend your time or what activities to pursue. Your economic dependence on family made it dangerous to express disagreement or pursue different goals. Intellectual isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Without education or access to books, your mind was cut off from the wider world of ideas. You couldn't read about other places or times. You couldn't engage with philosophy, literature, or scientific ideas. Your intellectual world was limited to local gossip, religious teachings, and practical knowledge. This lack of intellectual stimulation had devastating effects on mental health. Human minds need challenge and variety to remain healthy. But your brain was stuck in repetitive patterns of work and worry. There was no outlet for creativity, curiosity, or growth. The isolation was self-reinforcing because it made you dependent on the very systems that oppressed you. Without outside perspectives or alternatives, the miserable conditions of your life seemed normal and unchangeable. You couldn't imagine different ways of living because you had no exposure to them. Even in moments of crisis, when you most needed support, isolation often intensified. Illness could make you a burden, rather than receiving sympathy. Difficult pregnancies might be seen as punishment for sin, rather than medical emergencies requiring help. Death of children was so common that others might offer only perfunctory comfort before expecting you to return to normal functioning. This social isolation created psychological prison that was almost harder to bear than the physical hardships. Humans are social creatures who need connection, understanding, and emotional support to thrive. When these needs go unmet, the result is depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness that can be more devastating than hunger or cold. The isolation also made it nearly impossible to organize for change or improvement. Women couldn't unite to demand better conditions because they were kept separate and suspicious of each other. They couldn't learn about alternatives because information was controlled by the same authorities who benefited from maintaining the status quo. This systematic isolation was one of the most effective tools for maintaining female oppression. By keeping women ignorant, dependent, and separated from each other, medieval society ensured that they couldn't challenge the system that exploited them. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy for social control. Breaking free from this isolation required extraordinary circumstances or exceptional courage. Most women never found opportunities to connect meaningfully with others or to envision different possibilities for their lives. They lived and died within the narrow confines of their assigned roles, never knowing what they might have accomplished with different opportunities. Now let's explore the rare exceptions, the few women who managed to escape or transcend the normal fate of medieval peasant women. These stories are fascinating not just because they're inspiring, but because they highlight just how extraordinary you had to be to break free from the system that bound most women to lives of grinding poverty and subordination. Religious life offered one of the few legitimate escape routes for women, but even this path was fraught with challenges and limitations. Becoming a nun required a dowry, just like marriage, which most peasant families couldn't afford. The church wasn't interested in supporting poor women. They wanted financially valuable additions to their communities. If you could somehow scrape together the necessary resources, or if you were exceptionally devout and caught the attention of religious authorities, joining a convent could provide education, security, and relative autonomy. Nuns learned to read and write, managed substantial property, and wielded significant influence within their communities. But convent life wasn't necessarily easier than secular life. The daily schedule was rigorous, with prayers beginning before dawn and continuing throughout the day. Physical comforts were deliberately limited as part of spiritual discipline. You exchanged one form of hardship for another, trading secular suffering for religious austerity. Some exceptional women rose to positions of genuine power within religious hierarchies. Abbesses controlled vast estates, commanded networks of subordinates, and influenced political and economic decisions. Women like Hildegard of Bingen became renowned scholars, artists, and advisors to rulers. But these were extraordinary individuals whose success depended on rare combinations of intelligence, determination, and favorable circumstances. Even successful religious women faced constraints that limited their impact. They could only exercise authority within specifically religious contexts. They couldn't participate in secular politics, conduct business independently, or challenge fundamental social structures. Their influence, while real, operated within carefully controlled boundaries. Widowhood could sometimes provide opportunities for independence, but only under very specific circumstances. If your husband died and left you property, and if you had adult sons to protect your interests, and if local authorities didn't interfere, you might gain some autonomy. But most widows became burdens on their families, or were quickly remarried to new husbands. The few successful widow businesswomen typically inherited existing enterprises and had the education or connections necessary to maintain them. Even then, they faced constant challenges from male competitors who resented female success and legal systems that discriminated against women in commercial matters. Some women gained influence through relationships with powerful men, but this path was extremely dangerous. Becoming the mistress of a lord or king could provide luxury and influence, but it also made you vulnerable to sudden disgrace, violence, or abandonment. Your power was entirely dependent on maintaining male approval, which could disappear without warning. Royal and noble women had more opportunities than peasants, but they still faced severe limitations. Even queens were expected to focus primarily on producing male heirs and supporting their husbands' political goals. Women who tried to exercise independent authority often faced rebellion, assassination, or other forms of violent resistance. Occasionally, women gained recognition for exceptional skills in traditionally male domains. Some became renowned healers, developing expertise in herbal medicine that gave them influence and respect. Others gained fame as prophets or visionaries, using religious authority to exercise social influence. But these roles were always precarious, dependent on maintaining community approval and avoiding accusations of witchcraft. Merchant families sometimes provided opportunities for women to participate in business, especially in textile production and trade. Women in these families might learn to read, write, and manage accounts. They could inherit businesses and property, though they typically needed male guardians or partners to conduct certain types of transactions. Even successful businesswomen faced constant discrimination and suspicion. Their competence was often attributed to male guidance rather than personal ability. They had to work twice as hard as men to achieve the same level of respect, and their success was always viewed as exceptional rather than normal. The craft guilds occasionally admitted women, but usually only as widows of guild members, or in specifically female-dominated trades like brewing or textile work. Even within these guilds, women faced restrictions on the types of work they could do and the authority they could exercise. Wars and social upheavals sometimes created temporary opportunities for women to exercise unusual authority. When men died in large numbers or were away fighting, women might step into leadership roles by necessity, but these gains were typically reversed when normal conditions returned. Some women gained fame through extreme religious devotion, becoming saints or martyrs whose stories inspired others. But achieving this kind of recognition often required enduring horrific suffering or death, making it a dubious form of success. The rarest and most remarkable exceptions were women who successfully challenged social expectations through sheer force of personality and intelligence. These individuals managed to carve out spaces for themselves, despite overwhelming opposition, often by finding ways to make themselves indispensable to powerful men or institutions. But even these exceptional women faced constant pressure to conform to feminine ideals. Their success often required adopting masculine characteristics, while still maintaining enough femininity to avoid complete social rejection. They had to be strong but not threatening, intelligent but not arrogant, capable but not independent. The stories of successful medieval women are inspiring, but they also highlight how extraordinary circumstances had to align for any woman to escape the normal fate of subordination and suffering. For every woman who achieved fame or independence, thousands lived and died in anonymity, never having the opportunity to develop their potential or pursue their dreams. These exceptions prove that medieval women possessed the same intelligence, ambition, and capability as men, but they were systematically denied opportunities to develop and express these qualities. The few who succeeded did so despite the system, not because of it. The rarity of female success stories also demonstrates how effectively medieval society suppressed women's potential. By making it nearly impossible for women to gain education, accumulate resources, or exercise authority, the system ensured that most remained trapped in cycles of poverty and subordination. Understanding these exceptions helps us appreciate just how restrictive and oppressive medieval life was for the vast majority of women. The few who escaped serve as proof of what might have been possible if society had been organized differently, if women had been given equal opportunities to develop their talents and pursue their goals. But for every Hildegard of Bingen or successful merchant woman, there were millions of peasant women whose names history never recorded, whose talents were never developed, whose dreams were never pursued. Their untold stories represent one of history's greatest wastes of human potential. A reminder of how social systems can crush individual possibility beneath the weight of tradition and prejudice. But we haven't even talked about the psychological torture that medieval society inflicted on women through its legal system. Because if you thought being physically powerless was bad, wait until you discover how the law treated you as literally less than human. Let's start with the most fundamental legal reality of medieval life. You had no legal identity. None. You weren't a person in the eyes of the law. You were property. First, you belonged to your father. Then, you belonged to your husband. If he died, you might belong to your eldest son, your deceased husband's brother, or whoever the local lord decided should control you. You never, ever belonged to yourself. This wasn't just a technicality that affected theoretical legal situations. It shaped every moment of your existence. You couldn't own property in your own name. You couldn't enter into contracts. You couldn't sue someone who wronged you. You couldn't testify in court in most circumstances. You couldn't make decisions about your children's futures. You couldn't even leave your house without permission from your male guardian. The concept of consent didn't exist for women. Your father could promise you in marriage to anyone he chose, and you had no right to refuse. It didn't matter if the man was cruel, diseased, or decades older than you. It didn't matter if you found him repulsive, or if he already had a reputation for violence. Your feelings were irrelevant. Only your father's economic and political interests mattered. Once married, the situation got worse. Your husband had legal ownership of your body. Marital rape wasn't a crime, because the concept of marital rape didn't exist. Your husband could force sex on you whenever he wanted, and refusing him was grounds for legal punishment. The church taught that a wife's duty was to submit to her husband's desires, no matter how degrading or painful. If your husband beat you, you had no legal recourse. Domestic violence wasn't a crime. It was a husband's right and responsibility. The only restriction was that he shouldn't maim or kill you, and even those rules were loosely enforced. If you complained about abuse, you were more likely to be punished for disobedience than he was for violence. The legal system's treatment of rape reveals just how little your life was worth. If you were raped, the crime wasn't considered an assault against you. It was considered property damage against your father or husband. The rapist might have to pay compensation, but not to you. The money went to the man who owned you as compensation for damaging his property. Even worse, if you were raped and became pregnant, you could be punished for adultery. The legal system assumed that women who conceived during rape must have enjoyed it, because the medical understanding of the time claimed that women could only conceive if they experienced pleasure. This pseudo-scientific nonsense meant that rape victims faced additional persecution for the crime committed against them. If you were accused of adultery, the penalties were severe and often fatal. You could be divorced, cast out of your community, or even executed, depending on local laws and customs. Your husband could kill you for adultery in some jurisdictions, and it was considered justifiable homicide. But men who committed adultery faced much lighter penalties, if any. The double standard extended to every aspect of sexual behavior. Men were expected to have strong sexual desires and were often excused for extramarital affairs. Women were expected to be pure, chaste, and submissive. Any sign of sexual agency or desire was considered evidence of moral corruption that needed to be punished. Inheritance laws were designed to ensure that women could never accumulate significant wealth or power. Even if your father left you property, it typically passed to your husband upon marriage. If your husband died, his property went to his male relatives or children, not to you. You might receive a small dower portion for your support, but this was usually barely enough to survive and was often controlled by male trustees. The few women who did inherit substantial property faced constant legal challenges from male relatives who felt entitled to control family wealth. These inheritance disputes could drag on for years, consuming whatever resources you might have had in legal fees and bribes. Even if you won these battles, you were likely left impoverished by the process. Legal guardianship laws ensured that women were never truly independent. Even wealthy widows required male guardians to conduct business, sign contracts, or appear in court. These guardians were supposed to protect women's interests, but they often exploited their positions for personal gain. You might find yourself legally bound to men who stole from you, but you had no recourse because challenging your guardian's authority was nearly impossible. The court system was entirely male-dominated and hostile to women's interests. Judges, lawyers, and juries were all men who shared the prejudices of their time. Even when laws theoretically protected women, these protections were rarely enforced. Male solidarity often trumped legal obligations, especially when it came to protecting other men from the consequences of their actions against women. Women couldn't serve as witnesses in many types of legal proceedings, particularly those involving serious crimes or significant property disputes. Even when your testimony was allowed, it was given less weight than a man's. The legal system assumed that women were inherently less reliable, more emotional, and more likely to lie than men. This exclusion from legal proceedings meant that crimes against women often went unpunished simply because there were no legally acceptable witnesses. A man could assault, rob, or even kill a woman in the presence of other women, and their testimony might not be sufficient for conviction. This created a system where violence against women was effectively decriminalized. The church courts, which handled matters related to marriage, morality, and spiritual issues, were particularly hostile to women. These religious tribunals were obsessed with controlling female sexuality and punishing women for perceived moral failures. They could impose punishments ranging from public humiliation to excommunication, effectively destroying a woman's life and social standing. Contract law was another area where women faced systematic discrimination. Even when women were allowed to enter contracts, these agreements were often voidable by male relatives who claimed to be protecting women from their own poor judgment. This made it nearly impossible for women to engage in independent business activities or accumulate wealth through their own efforts. Property laws varied by region, but they universally favored male inheritance and control. Women might have the right to use property during their lifetimes, but they rarely had the right to sell, mortgage, or bequeath it freely. This system ensured that wealth remained concentrated in male hands across generations. The legal treatment of children born to unmarried women reveals another layer of systematic oppression. These children were considered illegitimate and had no legal rights to their father's property or support. The women who bore them faced social ostracism and economic hardship, while the men who had fathered the children faced no legal consequences whatsoever. Even the few legal protections that existed for women were often meaningless in practice. Laws requiring husbands to provide adequate support for their wives were rarely enforced, unless the neglect was so extreme that it threatened the woman's life. Laws prohibiting the most severe forms of domestic violence were applied inconsistently and often ignored entirely. The legal system's treatment of women's work reveals how thoroughly their contributions were devalued. Despite the fact that women's labor was essential to medieval society, this work had no legal recognition. Women couldn't demand payment for their services, couldn't form professional associations, and couldn't seek legal remedies for workplace injuries or exploitation. This legal invisibility extended to women's intellectual contributions as well. Women couldn't hold copyrights or patents for their innovations. They couldn't establish schools or other institutions in their own names. Their writings and artistic works were often attributed to male relatives or simply ignored by the historical record. The cumulative effect of these legal disabilities was to create a system of apartheid based on gender. Women were excluded from every form of meaningful participation in society and relegated to a second-class status that was enforced through the full power of the state and church. This wasn't just discrimination. It was systematic dehumanization carried out through legal mechanisms. Understanding these legal realities helps explain why so few women were able to escape their circumstances. It wasn't just a matter of individual choice or effort. The entire legal framework was designed to prevent women from achieving independence or challenging male authority. Breaking free required not just personal courage, but also extraordinary circumstances that allowed women to circumvent or overcome legal obstacles. The psychological impact of living under such a legal system was devastating. You grew up knowing that you had no rights, no recourse, and no protection under the law. This knowledge shaped your entire worldview, teaching you to expect injustice and to accept subordination as natural and inevitable. This legal oppression also created internal conflicts that were psychologically damaging. You were taught to respect authority and follow laws. But those same laws treated you as subhuman. You were expected to be moral and virtuous, but you had no legal standing to defend yourself against those who exploited or abused you. The arbitrariness of legal enforcement made life even more psychologically challenging. You never knew whether laws would be applied fairly or whether your complaints would be taken seriously. This uncertainty created constant anxiety and made it difficult to plan for the future or make decisions with confidence. Now let's delve deeper into the horrifying medical